Today we're going to talk to Chris Beeman, who is the associate producer of Ancient Futures Learning from Ladakh. And Chris, I'd like you to introduce yourself.
Okay. Yeah, we talked about this before, and I've been worrying the whole day since then about how to introduce myself. How about we start with the ecological and say something like, in distinct contrast to other members of my family, I really noticed my own relationship as a child with the natural world. And I think I've been working on that in a non-formal way for most of my life. And in a professional sense, I'm an associate professor at Brandon University, and I teach in the area of Indigenous theories of knowledge and Indigenous ontologies. My academic work, as you know, Bob, explores the notion of indigeneity ontologically, that is, to do with state of being, as opposed to simply or only to do with ethnicity. And I think I'm also working right now, this is just me at the moment, but I'm working on creative expression as a way of giving meaning to ideas that's different than standard academic discourse. How's that?
That sounds good. Tell me what Ancient Futures is about.
The subject is really progress and development under critique. It takes the example of Ladakh, in which the forces of development at the time the film was made in the early 90s had converged really rapidly. And so in Ladakh, you can see, in the space of 20 years, you can see, similar in European context to maybe a couple of 100 years of change, rapid change, as a traditional culture that's integrated with the land comes to be put under pressure from external forces. And those pressures have a lot to do with canceling people's relationship with the land and putting them into a moneyed economy. That's in an economic sense, but also in an emotional sense, causes them to start to compare themselves to people from other parts of the world who are part of a money economy and come up in their own eyes as failures because of their lack of material resources. And the film eventually starts talking at the end about ways of resistance to that almost inexorable pressure of this kind of hidden force of progress, in quotation marks, in traditional Ladakh. And one of the phrases just used was something like, cultural traditions limit populations so the carrying capacity of the land is never exceeded, something like that. And so that's kind of shorthand for a bunch of much bigger ideas. The cultural traditions that are being referred to there obliquely are polygamy and polyandry. There may be other ones as well, but these are the ones that we had in mind when we were thinking of this section. And polygamy is one man partnering with many women, and polyandry is one woman partnering with many men. And so you can imagine in the first circumstance, the cultural practice will tend to increase the size of the population. And in the second, the cultural practice will tend to decrease the size of the population. So it's kind of interesting that things that in Western context might be seen as being, primarily ethical issues are actually in this context and practices that are actually to do with human survival within an ecosystem. So in this case, what we saw were images of people working in fields, hand labor, no machines, diverting water, talking about how villages grew up around the runoff from glaciers. And so the glacier runoff was channeled into these long, small canals that basically work to irrigate fields. And later on in the film, it talks about how the water is shared amongst people. But really the idea is that there's this paying attention to the natural world. So runoff of glaciers plus gravity equals capacity for fertility. that otherwise wouldn't be possible in a really arid environment. Those cultural practices help to ensure that the successful ways of doing that continue and the unsuccessful ways don't continue. One of the things I noticed in that clip too was I came across people making the materials of which the house was built. But that design that, in this last clip I'm watching at 7:08, you can't tell whether it's the angle of the camera, wide angle lens, or not, but it actually is a slightly angled inward building. So all the four major walls are angled slightly inwards. And so you can imagine it's a very stable structure. And then the fact that when they were doing the building of the making the bricks, there was a song going on. And I thought about this recently, but an emeritus professor at Brandon, where I teach, Lynn Whidden, when she went back 40 years ago and was making recordings of, I think, Inuit and other First Nations groups, Indigenous groups across the top of Turtle Island, she realized that almost every activity had a song associated with it. And you'll see it in the film when sometimes it's the same song used for different contexts, but it's often a different song in different contexts. And so the gathering of the grains at the end of the film, there's a particular song that I often think of, and the translation is roughly "slow down, take it easy," which is kind of like the opposite of what you'd expect in the Western conception, which is jobs that need to be done. And you've talked before about, I hope it's okay to say this because your students are listening, but liking to potter. But I gave some reflection to that. And I think that's the way to go. Because by working at a pace that's responsive to the context, and so that you're listening to what the world is telling you, I call it flow mode at the farm. You seem to be moving slowly, but actually a lot gets done because the errors that really slow you down tend not to be made as much. But I'm thinking about that game, the kind of the rock game we just talked about, the rules of which we don't know, and how there's a bunch of people sort of gathered around. That was so frequent. I saw this so frequently there. So something that two people are doing turns into something the whole community is doing. And I think the voiceover was something like work and leisure are one. And so this kind of joy that I think comes because of unhurriedness, that comes because when you make that peace with the environment and understand that your labor is required, but if you're not trying to accumulate more and more wealth, then you can work at a certain pace. And if the climate is relatively friendly, as it's, of course, at the time we made the film, I don't think climate change was on the radar at all. But if the climate is predictable, and that's part of the human, environmental interchange, then you can actually know that you need this many kilograms or roughly this big a bag of barley to make it through the winter. So I see the cultural practice of like that idea in the song itself telling you to slow down is a kind of cultural attempt to work at a pace that's sustainable and responsive to the environment. So it's going slowly enough that you can actually listen, not just with one sense, but with all your senses to what's happening around you. But I'm looking at the image now of the two, looks like two women. They're talking in a friendly way. They're kind of cuddling the animals, probably to keep them in place, but also because they don't seem to be stressed at all. And then they're cutting and having a conversation that they need from the wool. So that's the kind of agreement, as it were, with the animal. But the animals are treated in a way that they're treated in general. I saw animals being treated really, really kindly and in a very sort of, I want to say, personal way. So Tashi Rabkis, who's the elder man who introduces a philosopher and poet later, he has a little clip in which he talks about Ladakis being the real economist because they take care of things and nothing is wasted. So he's just such a beautiful, to me, like his manner is lovely, but his phrasing is beautiful and so simple, right? And he's, to me, absolutely correct. You mentioned Salin's work before, and you sent a copy to me, and I've been looking at it. But this idea that economics really is about the home, this sort of broader sense of home that we live in. So these Ladakis who were, by force of necessity, they were having to live in a particular place and couldn't live elsewhere, and the place happened to be a very difficult place, which is why they weren't being bullied out, as lots of Western forces tend to do, colonizing forces tend to do. So because no one else wants to live there, then if you want to live there, no one must live there because it's tough. So if you want to live there, you have to really understand the place. And so the idea that the concept of waste was actually anathema to traditional way of life, because how could there be waste when everything comes from the land and ultimately goes back to the land, and there's nothing that is foreign to it or unable to be absorbed into it. So then that led to this other passage where Tesseragus is talking about interrelationship and interdependence. And so, which to me is very similar to North American Turtle Island indigenous concepts of interconnectedness. So he talks about, plants depending on soil, which depends on sunlight and water, but then the animals depend on plants and the humans depend on the plants and the animals. And so there's this interconnection. And if you actually live that, then you're actually experiencing your position in the world utterly differently. So to be a person is a completely different event than it is in the modern West. In the modern West, to be a person is to be conscious of our own desires and to fulfill our desires, often as an individual. But if you're actually living enmeshed in an ecosystem in which the evidence of that enmeshment, you could call an entanglement in an immanent materialist sense, if those entanglements are, as it were, being expressed in everything you do and in each moment, not just of your actions, but of your thinking, then I think you're actually living in the world as a completely different kind of person. How's that?
That's good.
Okay, so this scene that I'm looking at now is we've come through a bunch of things talking about funerals, cycle of life and death, position of women being relatively powerful when the interests of the household are prominent, and then losing power when the demands of the modern West and a cash economy comes in. That this is when we're getting to harvest time. It would have been July, and the fields are dry, and people are. The way the harvest is done is groups of people kind of line up next to each other, and then just go as a group toward the end of the field. And there's small fields, and there's singing going on all the time. And one of those lines that I'm looking at now was mine. That's the you're initially pulling out the grain and then leaving it to dry on its side in the sun, and then later on people will take the seeds off, and then they'll be winnowed and then be, I guess, ground down using that the stone grinding system that's water driven. Anyway, so in this day, we just finished singing, and I think I noticed this older guy with a grandchild, and this whole feeling like the work is almost never done on one's own. The work is almost always done in a group with people who are friendly. And then the reciprocity that's demanded, it means that next week it'll be someone else's harvest, and you go over to their place. And so if you think about it in sort of Western economic terms, it's very inefficient because there's a lot of people, not doing that much. But if you think about it in terms of sustainability of a culture within an ecosystem without external inputs, it's probably one of the few ways in which it can be done. We've had lots of conversations, you and I, about, because I wrote about attentive receptivity, this idea that I worked on in my dissertation, about this deep relationship with the natural world that sort of describes what I was saying a bit about earlier, this interconnection with place such that the boundaries of the self fall away. But you introduced the notion of culture as being important. And I think actually for it to be sustainable, it probably is important, that we need to have the cultural element, not just for the sake of friendship and community and a sense of connecting with other people within a landscape, but also because it's through culture that these practices get passed on to the next person. What's interesting, of course, is what happens when that process is interrupted by the process of development. It wants very different things of people in place. You talk about in the talk you give in my class about how colonization occurred well before, for example, European people went to Turtle Island in North America, and that colonization has been a part of human history for a long time. And really what was wanted was people's land and their labor. So if you're living in a place like that has never actually experienced domination by an external force, they're now part of India, and of course those pressures are now coming to play, or were when I was there, but it never actually been subdued, say, militarily, then kind of what's wanted of the land and the people is a very different thing, because it's wanted by the people. And one I would say also, it sounds like a stretch, but I would offer that it's wanted by the land as well. This relationship that has to do with a continued relationship through practices of what we would call sustainability. not militarily dominated, but still through economically, culturally, and then psychologically, the same effects occurring as would have happened if a culture had um, been dominated militarily. And this is why I think Helena refers to this idea there being this inexorable force, but the pressures are still there. And I guess the question becomes why the pressures there? The expensiveness of really, I don't know if you want to call it capitalism or neoliberalism or whatever it is now. It's like it's a bit like a billionaire needing an extra, $100 million. The billionaire doesn't need that money, but in the same way, the forces of capitalism are almost, um, or neoliberalism are almost self-perpetuating. They lead to expansion leads to expansion leads to expansion, and it cannot contain itself. I think because it's inherently disconnected from an ecosystem that naturally contains something like that. Okay, so there's a couple of scenes in school, and the classrooms that are depicted for me are really similar to. So it's not Ladakhi education; it's actually Indian government education, and so it's completely common for a ton of people to be packed in a small space with very few resources, and usually a teacher at the front. So it's very much a kind of British colonial era style schooling. And one of the quotations, in fact, is, the teacher saying, "I appreciate the poetry of Wordsworth," and the kids are starting to sort of chant along beside her. Another one is a quotation which is like an English saying, "When health is lost, something is lost. When character is lost, everything is lost." So you've got kids, relatively young students, who may be high school age or something, who are basically they're learning the values of a culture through. So the sayings of a culture, this is what's depicted in the film anyway, are in a sense teaching values that may be external to their own, that are part of the learning of language. And that kind of is an inverse expression of Paulo Freire's notion of pedagogy that's liberatory. And so he worked, as you know, in Brazil, and this, he wrote Pedagogy of the Press in 1970, I think, or early 70s. So he worked with adult in adult literacy, and he was working with basically workers. And he began to realize that language is inherently politically imbued. And so the kind of words he used were part of what those kind of words changed the nature of whatever they could contribute to, not just a person's learning of a language, but they could contribute to the changing of a situation for the person. So the film also talks about people learning the values through textbooks. So there's the very, very sweet kid who's reading from, and totally thrilled to be on camera reading from his little book. And it's all about the glory of industrial development in India, right? And Ladakh is, although it's politically contained with India, it's not India. It's a completely different culture from the Hindu majority of Hindu and some Islamic member. But those are the two major parts of, especially Hindu, of India at the time. And then Ladakh is this little, mostly Buddhist, partly Muslim, but partly Buddhist. I want to refer a little bit to the guy Wangchuk Sekmal, who talked about how students would so that when they went to school, they'd have to learn Urdu, which is the language of Jammu Kashmir, so not Ladakhi. And then suddenly, sort of middle way through, they'd have to switch, and they'd have 2 years of learning English, and then they had to write the exams, the major exams. Again, British system, like the A levels and the O levels. So at a certain age, then basically your future is decided, even though you might be 11 years old or something. And they had to write exams in this language, and almost all failed. Like cut off from the prospect of making it in the moneyed economy, and having lost all ties with traditional culture. So they were really lost. He gives the example too, which is really around experiential learning, about how students could, they went to school, and what they learned was a kind of way of thinking about the world where they would theorize about things. So they, in terms of how to make tea, they could tell you exactly how to make tea, but they couldn't make tea. And so this idea that education comes to stand for, it's like abstract ingenuity or capacity, as opposed to something which really benefits a person or a community. So, Bob, you just asked me to summarize the experience and talk about what I came away from the Himalayas with. Not sure I can answer the latter question, but in response to the former, I would say that when I went to Ladakh, this is before there were widely available programs in development studies, for example, and yet my interests were strongly in that area. And so, when I was in India, right, the placement given to me was to be on a Gandhian ashram, which is not a spiritual place. It's actually a place of really often resistance to dominant forces. And so I'd experienced this on one of the Gandhian ashrams in Uttar Pradesh, and the guy who ran it trained with Gandhi, and so he understood the principles of things like Swaraj and so on. And so, you'd see there were different groups that had to do with, for example, protecting the interests of women who were underrepresented, groups that could help people form legal arguments against intrusions by landlords, people who were ecologically oriented. And so I began to think about the concept of development quite critically. Western concepts of development. I'm not trained academically in this area, so I'm not in step with whatever is being studied by the students in your class. But at a practical level, Ladakh confirmed to me that there were examples of people who had lived for many, many generations and were still, living in the world, unlike many indigenous people in North America who had managed to be burdened with many different aspects of colonization and many people killed and so on. And then through the process of residential schools, many people not successfully knowing how to resist. But there were people in the world who were still living, and there are now, I know, many more indigenous people in North America are doing that too, but who were living in ways that showed a different kind of possibility for humanness. And, I felt very much as though I were kind of witnessing for me a way better way to be a person in the world. And so when I left Ladakh, and we had a couple of years of editing process and stuff, I started farming more seriously, and for many years ran a community shared agriculture farm, because I kept on feeling that it was very hard to find work in the world that wasn't in some way contributing to terrible effects of neoliberalism. And that's my wording now, speaking back on the day. So, but thinking about small scale local agriculture as being pretty hard to fault. It wasn't damaging the environment. It was in some sense helping ecosystems. It was about a local community of people. So that led to the community shared agriculture projects of 7 or 8 years. And then I was back in academia studying things again. But those, I think it was actually, there was a kind of a sense of solidarity, or it sounds funny, but a sense of really being motivated to live a better kind of life is what I think I experienced from the brief time that I got to spend in Ladakh. And I'm painfully aware of how far short of that I've managed to get, right, in terms of my own life. And I know that because I am losing grammar now, that it probably means I actually find it really hard to talk just without much of a prompt. So if you want to have a conversation, it's probably better if we talk together.
Well, I really admire the fact that people, and I try to do this myself on my farm, is try to slow it down. I sometimes think that I'm addicted to development in that I like to build things, have ever since I can remember. But I also think it's important to share this. And I try to do that both on the farm, and I try to do it through my role as an educator. You're teaching at Brandon. How do you apply the things that you've learned in your educational role?
Yeah. I think it's funny because I'll just talk about this term. It's been an odd term, obviously, because we're teaching online. And so I'm really aware that my students, for most of their days, are sitting in front of a screen and having to focus on the screen. And so when I'm teaching, I say, I think we start the class with welcome in a few different languages, mostly First Nation languages. And then I say, "Hello, you beautiful persons, you glorious nations," including First Nations. And then I say, "Turn off your cell phone device unless you're using it to get this class, and otherwise turn off the alerts." And then I want you to find a way to be sitting so you can see outdoors, not look at your screen. And then let that be the background for, if you need space to be taken up by some part of your brain synapses firing, then let it be taken up by at least observing the natural world. And then we spend part of each class outside. I send my students off and they go to their sit spots. It's now cold and I haven't been teaching for a few weeks because they've been off in schools, but as I teach in the Faculty of Education, but they'll come back and we'll find ways of being outside. And so it's really breaking the kind of expected form of learning. And I think it's also getting away from, I'm highly abstract in my academic writing. I'm aware of that, and there's a reason for it. But I also try to be practical where I can so that I can link the abstract ideas to the world. And we try to do that in the class as well. And we make connections between people's lives. And when we're talking about ideas around indigeneity, we're often talking about, these are, often kids from farms and who may be industrially oriented in their farming. And it's not the same as hands-on. But there's some points of correlation that can be made. So connecting people to the earth, I think that's a part of it too. Yeah. I'm not sure. I'd like to know how you teach in your classes and how you chat, because I'm really interested in Indigenous modes of teaching and learning, and Indigenous, again, considered ontologically, not simply subject matter. So I'd love to hear about you and more what you do in your classes.
Well, I guess I have categorized things a little bit. I'm now teaching just theory because at this point I think it's really important to look at a whole picture. And theory is an interesting way to approach learning, because what you're asking really, or what you're teaching really, is to ask the question, what if? And that's what theory is all about. And so I think it has its place, but we also teach a similar course where we use Indigenous theory for 6 to 8 weeks of teaching, and then we take students out on the land and allow them to experience a relationship with the land. We provide them 1,000 calories a day, and they have to provide for themselves through fishing and harvesting natural plants, and also harvesting from an organic garden. And what's interesting is that they actually develop a sense of community within that 10 days. So much so that the classes have actually stayed in touch with each other much more than a class in a classroom. And they report that after they go home, for instance, when we take them back to Kingston, many of them report that they have a really hard time going back into their apartment or their house, and they have to sit on the grass outside for a while just to get themselves prepared to go back into a more developed world. And that's good.
Yeah.
I think that what I'm hoping is that students will take from that, and some do. Some of my students have actually gone into small-scale farming and wolfing and things like that, because they do find that through re-indigenization, they end up, as you say, wanting to become human, wanting to live life rather than just be living.
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, it's almost like when I've talked with you before about attentive receptivity, this particular circumstance of this, I think of it being an ontological state of perceiving self and world as being interconnected, all part of the same stuff, as it were. That's one expression of it that I think probably comes from long-term living in the world in that way. But even the small act of growing food, and this idea that I was talking about before about eating your own labor, right? So the idea that you actually it's not just that you're eating those nice potatoes that you planted in my case, first week of June to avoid potato beetles, usually earlier than that. It's also that you actually, at some point, you can't avoid the sense that it's you in concert with a wonderful, fruitful environment that has the capacity to give life. It's you interdependent with that. And I think I told you Alex Matthias, the elder I work with in Tamagami, he used the expression "jujum dakim," which etymologically is connected, means is translated as Mother Earth, but it's connected etymologically to breast milk, so that Earth is understood as being the source of life, and the humans who interact with the Earth, they're being given life from the Earth, and so that when you do things like grow your own food, it's unavoidable that at some level, be it highly theoretical, or be it sort of occasional thoughts towards, or in the deep sense of attentive receptivity, you can't avoid the sense that you're interdependent with the world. Something that's easy, completely easy to avoid thinking about or noticing it at all when you're simply making money and then buying stuff from a store, which is so far removed directly from your own labor.
I think we'll end it there, Chris. I think you've said
That's great.
Pretty well.